Success and other lies we've been told.
And here it is.
Until we started to ask those underprivileged, then that means
Born out of the depths of
those who are privileged.
We're all born on the same level playing field.
When I say the words white privilege, about half of the white population instantly gets defensive and they say, "How dare you?"
Welcome to Truth Be Told. I'm Reverend Dan. We are Soul Evolution Collaborative. This is episode 96, and our theme for this month is success and other lies we've been told. And it has been an amazing dive into a lot of these topics that I think have started to kind of bubble up to the surface in a lot of places, certainly not just within, communities, spiritual communities, New Thought communities like this, but I think topics that are really relevant and at the surface, kind of all over the place. I think if you spent longer than 30 seconds on TikTok, you've probably seen or heard these conversations happening. These ideas that we've all kind of been born into and have grown up with and have lived under certain assumptions and parameters. And this is the way it's been. And I think some of those "this is the way it's been" ideas maybe aren't working quite as well anymore. Actually, after this month, after this series, I think we can say definitively that a lot of those ideas are not working anymore, if they even ever worked. And so tonight is no different. We are exposing the truth behind privilege tonight. So this is success and other lies we've been told, exposing privilege. And I know at that word, this is like one of those like massive trigger words. You mention the word privilege and like half of the people scurry away and disappear, because it's like I think it's been introduced really poorly, actually. Like privilege as a word, as an idea, has been introduced to the public. Whoever did that, however that happened, has happened really poorly, because I think it's left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, as if it's as if you have had privilege, then you are to blame. If you have had privilege, then you've done something wrong. And really, that's not what it is at all. And yet, that's kind of the angle some of the conversations about it take. So I think tonight is going to be a refreshing perspective into privilege, what it really is, how it actually plays out, and maybe what we can do with it a little bit. And so just real quick, I like to think of privilege as it's kind of like if you're playing Monopoly and sorry, my phone is ringing on my computer. Apologies. If you're playing Monopoly, everybody starts with all the same money. Nobody has any properties. We're all on this equal playing field. And so in Monopoly, hypothetically, we all have the same opportunity to go around the board, collect money, buy the things, do the stuff, right? But imagine playing Monopoly and one person in the game starts already owning Park Place and Boardwalk. So maybe we start with all the same money, but they have inherited this massive real estate property. And everybody knows Park Place and Boardwalk, key to winning Monopoly. So that's a massive privilege to be able to be born into that. That doesn't make them a bad person. They haven't done anything wrong, but they have a massive leg up in this game than everyone else playing. So might it feel unfair for everyone else? Yeah, right? And so that's kind of what's happened in the world, is that people who have certain privileges have not necessarily done anything wrong, and yet for everyone else, it's like, wow, this game that we're playing certainly feels very unfair at the moment. And that's kind of just the gist, an easy way to look at it, rather than like, you have privilege and, we kind of point fingers maybe. So, everybody loves Monopoly so much, I thought it would be a super clear example. Anyway, so let's jump in here. Let's sit back, relax, and enjoy this next episode of Truth Be Told, Uncovering Privilege.
So I'm here to expose the lie of privilege. And here it is. The lie is that there's no such thing as privilege. This lie is born out of the depths of rugged individualism. This idea that asserts that we're all born on the same level playing field. So if each individual just works hard enough, long enough, good enough, and does all the right things, whatever that means, then everyone has the same shot at success. At least success as it's defined by the larger society. And this is solely determined by the amount of effort one asserts. So I'm just going to call it what it is. A lie. This lie has also crept into our spiritual understandings. The belief that everyone creates their own reality. Yes, and where it is true that we are powerfully creative beings, we can rise above terrible situations and create magical and powerful things. It is also true that we don't create in a vacuum. The culmination of all thought in our collective awareness outpictures in very real ways for very real people. And we see this in every aspect of our world. So with this understanding, the bumper sticker version of change your thinking, change your life can often overlook the very real experiences of people and assert blame instead of empowerment. And so the more we believe the lie that privilege is not a thing and that bootstrap mentality is the only answer, the more we perpetuate the frameworks and systems that create inequality and injustice, victim blaming and shaming, glossing over the impact because we are afraid to look our own privilege in the eye. If we ignore the power that privilege currently has, we discount the very real experiences of individuals in our world and individuals in our own communities. The playing field is not level. We can no longer trade this fact for the allure of rugged individualism. The fact is, it just doesn't add up to anything remotely associated with the truth. And it doesn't work. Nor does it create systems that work. It never has. But the amazing part of our creative ability is once we come to a greater awareness of something, we can begin to move, adjust, reevaluate, recreate. With a newfound awareness, we simply can't go back. We can't return to a place of unawareness. This knowledge must then catapult us forward in ways that acknowledge we have both the power and the opportunity to create something different in our world. So next up, a little more about the truth of privilege and how it presents itself, in ways our awareness can shed more light on the truth, in ways that move us towards transformation, towards evolution, towards truly creating a world that works for all.
It is no secret when we look at our world that conflict, polarization, and a framework of discontent abounds.
What if that didn't have to be?
What if that didn't have to be?
What if that didn't have to be?
The truth is that underneath it all is our innate hardwiring for love, connection, and belonging.
In our ever-evolving experience, now is the time.
Now is the time.
Is the time to unlearn societal constructs of the past.
And relearn what it means to be human.
To be human.
What it means to be human and a part of the global community.
This can only be done together.
This can only be done together.
This can only be done together.
We are being called to pack away the us versus them mentality and instead embrace the profound power of we.
Join Soul Evolution Collaborative.
Join Soul Evolution Collaborative
for the O-Shift Healing the Divide Summit,
November 14th through 17th.
November 14th through the 17th.
This event, through powerful speakers, engaging workshops, and collective conversation, will explore the transformative effects of healing the divide.
Now is the time for change.
Now is the time for healing.
Now is the time for healing the divide.
Success and other lies we've been told. This week we are going to expose privilege. Now, for as long as I've been alive, I've heard people talk about, those who are underprivileged. And that was never really, a big problem talking about it until we started to ask, well, if there's underprivileged, then that means that there are those who are privileged. And as soon as we started to talk about that, well, that pretty much divided half the conversation. The most common form of privilege that we talk about these days is the idea of white privilege, meaning that based on the color of your skin, you either have more or less barriers to success than other people have. So right away, when I say the words white privilege, about half of the white population instantly gets defensive and they say, how dare you talk about that? I worked my butt off for everything that I have. And nobody's saying that they didn't. It's just acknowledging that there's more barriers placed in front of some people than there are in front of other people. So it's not to, induce guilt or shame to anybody that came from an area, a background that enabled them more chances at success. We shouldn't feel blame. We shouldn't feel superior or inferior to anyone, because it's all based on the cosmic coin toss that kind of, dictates where people were born. So it's not to induce guilt, and it's not to say that you didn't work. It's just to acknowledge that we need to do more to kind of help remove some of those barriers that many people still face. Now, another myth that comes up around this idea of privilege is that just by talking about it and just by acknowledging it, that those who are in challenged situations, that by having the conversation, it's going to say to them that the cards are so stacked against them that it's not even worth trying. Now, of course, that's not what the point of this conversation is, and I don't think that is the result. I think it's just, again, bringing more awareness to the idea that these barriers exist, and as soon as we can acknowledge them, then we can start to ask the question of, how do we remove them and how do we make things better? Now, another misconception around the idea of privilege is that it's always, race. It's always based on white privilege. There's many different factors in society that can create, either a leg up or create, some of a hindrance, whether you come from like a very affluent background, or, it can be your gender identification can help or hinder, or sexual orientation. Maybe, having like a single parent working a couple jobs at home, or a couple jobs while you're at home alone, or the opposite of that, where you have a parent who, a couple who are, one is earning ample amounts of money while the other is able to be a stay-at-home parent, to be there to help with the homework, to help get children into different sports practices, extracurricular activities. These things are all different levels of privilege. It's not all based on race, but that is, of course, a very common part of the conversation these days. So the interesting thing with that is that you can experience privilege in a couple areas and simultaneously be experiencing underprivilege, or experiencing some of those barriers placed on you by society. So it's very complicated. It's not cut and dry. It's a spectrum. We've said that several times about several subjects. It's all just experience, all intertwined, and how it plays on each other is very interesting. So that leads me to kind of my last point around this idea of privilege. It creates a momentum moving forward. So if you are fortunate enough to be born into, an affluent school district, and you have a parent that can stay home, and maybe they have money to even, pay for excellent tutors or, coaches, all these different things that then help you lead up to get into Ivy League school, where you're going to get that coveted, college degree, that then when you get out, you have, friends' parents who are, just ready to get you into their business, offering jobs, all these things, to where then you end up earning a high income that puts you in an area where you contribute, money to a higher school district that has way more access to funds to support all the kids coming through. All these things, just kind of create more and more chances at success. And the flip side of that is if you're coming from a distressed area where, the median income is lower, that the schools are less funded, the teacher to student ratio is lower. Maybe your parent, is single and working 2 jobs, 3 jobs just to stay afloat. So they're not there to make sure that you make it to school or that you complete your homework. Maybe in this distressed part of town, crime rates are higher. So it's a challenge just to get to and from school safely. And then, the chances of you even ending up in a college opportunity are lower. And through that, you end up earning less money, and you're again kind of stuck in that cycle that just keeps going. Now, of course, there's exceptions to all of this on both ends of the privileged or the underprivileged. People, defy the odds all the time. But it is our role as society to try to create a level playing field, to try to remove those barriers. Like, we don't have to place more barriers in front of those that have privilege. That's not what this conversation's about. It's just about removing some of those other barriers, because when we uplift the many, we uplift everybody. It's just a natural way. It doesn't mean that when we help somebody else, that those that already have the privilege are going to be missing out. And that's where the flaw is in this idea of privilege, of even acknowledging that it exists.
We're going to be here a long time tonight.
I was thinking the same thing. I was just like, focus. All right. What do we? Wow. Yeah, this is, I think it's simultaneously a conversation that has some heaviness, but also and depth, quite a wide breadth, but also some really maybe simple things to take away from it. At least some things that came up for me, there are some really simple things about this that we can all take away and immediately make changes in our lives, in others' lives, really.
I think just, this conversation of just the awareness of it, the awareness of the fact that I've experienced privilege in lots of areas of my life that have gotten me to where I am now. And this awareness that that's not true for everyone. And so for me, this conversation actually, when we can look at it in this from this energy of the end goal of creating this world that works for all, then when we identify areas of privilege and how that's impacted people and how they can move about the world, and people who don't have that privilege, how they are limited in how they move about the world, then this conversation really sheds a spotlight of okay, this is the area. All right, we need to look at this area. And okay, all right, this is the area. We need to look at this area. So actually, it's instead of disempowering, it's very empowering, because we are identifying that this is true. This is an indisputable fact that privilege does impact how we move in the world. And also the lack of. And so instead of this conversation, is it important? Is it important? Does it exist? Does it not exist? Yes, it exists. Now what do we do? So it actually, like you said, it's very it's this empowering energy of we have finally cracked it. This is the thing. This is the thing that we need to look at. This is the thing. If we can shift in our awareness in this area, man, could it just crumble some of these old systems and frameworks and make room for something so powerful we just have no idea. We just cannot even fathom the impact that it could have.
Yeah.
I got sweaty there for a minute.
Breathe. Oh, okay. All right.
Breathe.
I think it's one of those words that can easily be hijacked. And I think that's the thing. Because Ryan, as I was listening to your segment first, a couple thoughts came to mind. And I think it's really easy to kind of pair up, it's kind of like those who speak against woke culture. You're oh, you're woke, yeah, being aware, being compassionate, being willing to become more aware, admit you don't know, being compassionate. I mean, it's just not never is that a bad thing, right? But it's easy enough to hijack it and kind of use it as ammunition in places, because they're calling you out on having privilege, and so that's bad, right? having privilege becomes like this bad thing. I think in a certain version of the conversation. And what just became really clear listening to your segment was it's never bad. What happens, I think, is the way we react, like as someone with privilege, the way I react to having that privilege, we have, I will say, like as white men, we have a long history of using that against people. And so blaming other people, like you're to blame for your failure, your lack of success, for being poor, for being this, for having what, like whatever the identity is, whatever the aspect is, it's like using my privilege to point the finger at you. That's where I think the conversation, like we've never been able to go there in most places, in most versions, in most happenstances of this conversation. We haven't been able to go there. It's like, no, you are not bad. You having privilege is not bad. But using that privilege to point the finger at the people who don't have the privilege, that's the part that's when it becomes not okay.
Yeah.
And well, just point blank, I think that's the thing we need to address more often than not about privilege. Like, yeah, having privilege is not bad, but using it as ammunition against other people is certainly not a good
Yeah, I mean, it's information.
Yeah.
The fact that you have privilege, or the fact that I have privilege in areas of my life, is information. And so it's an awareness that there are aspects of how we have set up life as we know it that don't support
Most
everyone equally. And it's just a fact. And so it's there. It's like, sometimes like you don't know what the problem is. And so we're trying to find the problem so we can fix it. We know what it is. There it is, right there. And so beginning to look at it, not in a and I think it's defensiveness. I mean, anytime that I think that is our first inclination, is defensiveness in this conversation. At least that's how I have observed it in conversation. And I think that if we can begin to look at it without that defensiveness, I think that we can begin to move forward in really powerful ways.
Maybe it's kind of unfortunate that the word privilege was used, because it does, for some people, it is such a trigger word that, when you say privilege to some people, like in their mind, it's like means that, everything was just handed to them. And, so that's why they get like all defensive, because, life is hard. Life is hard for everybody. And, this idea of talking about this isn't denying that. It's just trying to bring awareness, to those who have more barriers in front of them. And, it's interesting that like a lot of this, like when you learn about some of the barriers that exist, that have existed forever, and they're still perpetuated, it's, a lot of it I didn't learn until like the last, 5 years of my life. And so how do you go like that long without learning it? Like that's part of this system.
And that is the privilege.
Yeah, I mean, not even to have a conversation, that is privilege.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
And again, it's just like, why is kindness and compassionate, like, why is that idea considered woke and considered, bad? It's crazy, that this whole idea that somehow when we try to remove barriers for some, that in some people's eyes, that's like, well, that's making my life harder, because, like maybe in a certain sense it is, like people that
you can't take advantage of those people anymore.
Yeah. Or when you give, if we were to create equal and fair, educational opportunities, fund the schools equally and, fairly, equitably is probably, like the better word. Then all of a sudden, like, their kids who they've been putting, private school don't have that little advantage that's kind of been built into the system. So now they're going to have to, compete a little more against people that, before didn't have the opportunities necessarily.
Or we create systems that don't need the competition in the first, like that's where it gets really crazy when you realize we come full circle around again to like how the system has been created to put us all in these I mean, it's kind of designed this way, right? Like it's designed to put everybody into their pigeonhole where they belong based on the box they fit into, and you're supposed to be there, and that's where the system wants you, and that's why it's so challenging for certain people to bust out of those things, right? And I I totally agree that I think everybody in this within the system is having to work at whatever. I also think, from different perspectives, that means a lot of different things, right? And so if you spend time around kids, um, short of some extreme childhood adverse circumstance, kids can go through this thing where like something that they deem bad happens, and it's like the worst thing that's ever happened, and so they have the most dramatic response that they've ever had, because that really is to them the worst thing that has ever happened. And like watching this as an adult, I'm like, what? Like that's whoa. But like my instinct wants to be like, dude, she's like, calm down.
It's
Like
the worst thing that happens to you. You're doing pretty good.
yeah. But at the same time, it's like, wow, that actually is the worst. So until something worse than that happens, that's the worst thing that's ever happened. And so I might suggest that same idea also plays out in our lives. Like I worked really hard to get to where I am. We don't need to compare to other people, but for some people, working hard is really different than for somebody else who's working really hard. Like working hard from a very privileged perspective, yeah, you're gonna work hard and get stuff. It's gonna come fairly easy. So like working hard, if that's the hardest you've ever had to work, it may seem like working really hard. And yet, for somebody who's working 3 jobs and trying to take care, single parent working 3, whatever, like so many circumstances where like the way it is, they are probably not going to make it out of that situation. Like working hard is a whole other experience.
When it just leads back to that conversation that I think we've talked about over these weeks. Like it's that kind of like, it's that thing that's that infection that creates all of this stuff. And it's that rugged individualism, the infection.
Yeah.
That it really like this idea, it's that, we're all on the same level playing field, and you've got to work hard. And if you work hard, you can rise above, blah, 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 fill in the blah. And this idea that we have that it has to be struggle, we have to do it alone, we have to like this is the measure of all things. And if you're not doing it this way, then that you're, whatever. And I think that it just fuels this. It fuels this like it's like the carrot that you never reach, and you're always running for it, and it's just always going to never be enough. And so then then the system and the frameworks that we operate in are never going to be exactly. There's not going to be any satisfaction, because it's not how we were made to. It's not how we were made to operate. And so we're operating, once we talked about this before, we are operating in a system and a framework that is not the truth of who we are. And so it's uncomfortable, it's a struggle, it's hard, it's all these things that we talk about. And it's, I think that, it doesn't have to be that way. I think if we can recognize the barriers, we can recognize the things that stand in the way for some and not others, and then begin to create these frameworks where that isn't even a thing anymore. I don't know how we do that, but I do know it starts with recognizing the presence of it. But yeah, rugged individualism, I bought into that, Lord knows. I still, it's hard. It's hard to let go of that. And remember that, oh, wait, it doesn't have to be that way. I don't have to go it alone,
Well, it's interesting how, once again, it's almost like all of this was planned. It's almost like the order of the themes for each week, right? But I mean, it's like it becomes this cyclical thing where, like, I think we could probably go through the last 4 weeks of themes just over and over again, and we would just always keep coming back around, because, well, the privilege, like, well, why is privilege so important? Well, because our identities get tied into, it's like, well, I work hard and I'm going my whatever, I'm going to success, and my self-worth is tied in. All right, well, we talked about self-worth, and then that's all about whatever, what were the ones after that, self-worth, and then exhaustion as a state,
Competition. Yeah.
and then competition, and then back into privilege. And I mean, it just, like, the whole thing just keeps cycling over and over again. It's fascinating because it's just like, yeah, the net of it is, we are in this agreed upon contract within this society, within the United States for sure, within society, this agreed upon contract that this is how it is, and it's probably impossible to break out of it. So, I mean, but it just keeps, like, pulling us back in, and
Well,
there is a way to break out of it. There's a way to change it. There's a way to do it different. It's totally possible. And the solution certainly doesn't come from within the system of thinking that has created and perpetuates the system itself.
well, sometimes I think, well, I only speak from my personal whatever view, but sometimes I think we sit in our spiritual lives and our spiritual communities and say, those folks over there, they don't understand.
Mm.
But oh my goodness, we can see it even in our own
Well, that's this whole show, right?
teaching, and how sometimes it's taught, how privilege creeps in, doesn't it?
Mm.
And this whole, like I said, this change your thinking, change your life mentality. Well, yes, and there, we can't discount the experiences of others and this reality and this fact that we don't create in a vacuum, that there is this collective experience, and our collective thoughts are into this collective experience. And some of those thoughts and some of those things are not in alignment with a world that works for everyone. And so it's a yes and, so it's a bit of a paradox there. And so I think that we have to make sure in spiritual communities and our own spiritual work and how we move about the world, to make sure that how we're expressing that is not from a space of privilege and discounting the experiences of others. And I think that often we mean well, but
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, or if it does express from a place of privilege, that we recognize the privilege and make equitable space for everyone, right? I mean, because I think it is easy enough to make the privilege bad, or to speak as if privilege is bad, right? So it's like,
Right.
how do we, in working towards a new system where we're kind of breaking this cycle, how do we express the privilege that exists from within this cycle, and then also recognizes, I don't know all of the other experience. Like, I've never had any other experience, so I know, witnessing and talking and having conversations about other experiences, and that there's plenty of other experiences I haven't had. And then how do we talk about that in a way that creates space and an invitation, rather than, like, I think what you're saying is, we've created more barriers by
Yeah, and I
ignoring
think,
it, by bypassing it, by pretending like, oh, ultimate truth and it's all good and change your thinking and
right.
screw you all.
Yeah, and I think like you say, making space for that, I think that's the important first step.
Yeah.
But I think what's really huge is just the idea of education, of facts, of learning, things in the system. Doing the research for this, I found there's like 3 different studies that were very, very telling, that show, like, people that have, privileged, come from a privileged space, that our human nature, that when you're not aware of it, like right now, being aware of your own privilege is outside of the norm of human nature. And so people that have privilege, they have this innate sense that they really are better, that they, like, somehow earned everything that they have. And it's it was really interesting. One of the examples was, I love that you brought up the game of Monopoly. So they did a study where they played Monopoly, and by a flip of the coin, you either were player A or player B, and then they told everybody, all the participants, the game is rigged. So if you were the first player, you got your token was a shoe. If you're the other person, you got the Rolls Royce. Starting off, person B gets $2,000 cash, where person A only got 1,000. Every time you pass go, one person gets the 200, one person gets 100. But the thing is, and then like 2 dice compared to 1 dice, and just to see. But what they were really studying is how people reacted, and what they witnessed and watched as all these different one-on-one games progressed. The people that had the rules in their favor started acting differently. They had like pretzels out on the table, and the people that had that privilege were helping themselves, and the other people kind of like demurred a little bit. And they started like towards the end of these games acting in a way that said that they really did believe this, that they outplayed the other person, that they deserved to win. And it was
Wow.
really surprising to me. I did not, it's so obvious. And so I did not expect for that result to happen, but it still did. And there's a couple other studies that indicate the same kind of thing. And so, I mean, that's a hard thing to get through, is that human nature. If you have that sense just based on that privilege, it's going to be, challenging to get a large percentage of the population to just acknowledge it and want to make the change.
Yeah. Makes me wonder how much of the, what's counted as human nature from within the system that we've all always been in.
Oh, yeah.
Makes me wonder, like, if we had a control group or whatever, a different group that was not raised in this idea, is it really human nature, or is that just like a learned?
Yeah, it's
We're all
cultural.
really, culturalized to really learn that behavior. Because I can see certainly how in the world around us here that a certain certain people come to mind about thinking how much better they are than the rest just because, and it's like, yeah, that was handed to you, man. Like, no way.
Well, and when you were talking about that, Chris, I can't help but be like, oh shit, I've done that. Like I've had certain advantages in my life and have made certain life decisions and had certain things that, happen as a result, and, got to a certain place. And sometimes it can be very easy for me to look at others who have not done that and think, if they'd only done it this way, then,
Right.
they could have did, or, or to make someone else wrong, or their experience wrong or less than, or that I had the whatever. And oh man, doesn't that that pricks a little bit, because the truth is that I had privilege. It's not right or wrong. It's my experience. But this idea of then me taking this experience and then viewing it through other people's experiences through my lens,
Yeah.
that's when it begins, to be it gets a little wonky. And so even when you were speaking that, I'm like, oh, I still have a lot of work to do in my own experience of my own experiences of privilege, and then how I view and treat others who have not had that experience. And I think, and so that's not a bad thing. That's not like bad on me or bad on someone who has to continue to do their work. Because you know what? I hate to let y'all in a little secret. We all got to do it. We all have
Absolutely.
to continually be reevaluating how it shows up, because it's funny, like it show up over here, and then okay, we heal that, and we look at that, and we shift, and then it pops up over here now. And so I think that it's a really, if we look at it, it's a really empowering experience to look at these aspects and how it plays out in our life, because it's an amazing opportunity for transformation. It's an amazing opportunity for growth. It's an amazing opportunity for expansion and creating space for everyone's experience. And man, that's beautiful. That's not taken away from my experience. It's adding to it.
Yeah.
And if we can begin to look at it from that perspective, then this conversation just shifts and it becomes a really exciting opportunity, and not that shame and blame experience.
It makes me think about like what are the possibilities for society when we do start to have this conversation. talking about like the rugged individual kind of way. Like I worked really hard. So you have like, person A who worked really hard because they were able to come home from school and sit down and spend time on homework. Then you got person B who at 15 years of age had to go straight to a part-time job after work and was donating that paycheck to the family just to help cover rent. And and then struggling to get homework done after that, and then get up and be rested the next day to go do it all over again, and never quite being able to get ahead enough to fully open up, feel comfortable, not be in survival mode, to explore like what's in that mind. Like how many brilliant minds are out there that we never know about because they are stuck in this cycle of survival. If we could find a way to lift everybody up, like it's not altruistic to want to remove barriers for people. It's selfish. Society will be better if we can do that. It's the good kind of selfish that like to call it, but we would all benefit. Like what are we missing out on while we continue to allow these systems to operate the way they do?
Yeah. There's a way. We're going to do it. So definitely an ongoing conversation with a lot of room for exploration and learning. And I know my biggest takeaway from this month has been looking for some of the maybe obvious things that can be the easy things that can be done immediately. Certainly don't, they're not dismantling any systems, but the sharing of resources of food, of tools, of housing, of whatever, the things that are immediately available to us that start to make shifts for ourselves, for others, for the community around us, and at the same time the importance of that personal dive and exploration into what is ours to learn and know and grow, and how do we take part in shifting that collective consciousness around this whole thing. So thanks for tuning in. This is, as always, Truth Be Told, and this has been Success and Other Lies We Have Been Told. And so I think we've uncovered all of them. There's none left. We now know everything, right? No. So keep tuning in. We'll see you next week, because there's always more.